Are we good on your end? Okay. So normally I have about 14 or 15 Sundays in the course of the year in which I can teach a class, and there's about 18 or 19 sessions. I decided we'd start early. We'd start early with the class and then start this year, and we'll continue it into next year. We'll just, and each, I can't promise you how long each session will ultimately, where I need to break, but I'm going to try and keep them independent. So each will stand on its own. If you make one lesson, you can make as many as you want and still find value, hopefully. That's the goal. And the other thing is we got a new Siddur, so it really enabled and promoted the idea. The Siddur is a very interesting document. First of all, it is an encounter, it is not just about what am I feeling in the moment, that's there for sure, but it's an encounter with 3,000 years of history. Each time you go through the service, there's a history lesson in it. There's a theology lesson that's going on. We may not have the time to dig deeply into a lot of the volumes of Talmud and Bible, etc., and the Siddur becomes, in a sense, the document at which most Jews turn to. It's where most of our theology, we don't even realize we've been theologized, okay? But it's the document that really has taught most of us what it is Judaism says about, in a lot of ways. Services, it's composed of all these prayers, but not all prayers are the same. So let me give you four different kinds of prayers that'll show up. Number one, there's biblical citations. The authors of the Siddur assume you often know the Bible in advance. And so there's references there that they assume they're making assumptions that you know that you would pick up on. And a perfect example is L'Chadodi on Friday night. The first starts out Shamor v'Zachor, and one of the observe and remember. And they assume that you know there's two different versions of the Ten Commandments, and one starts out with Shamor and one starts out with the Zachor. Their assumption is there. Today that's probably not true, and that's why we have classes like this, is to pull that out. But the authors are inserting biblical text with the assumption that you know the references they're making. The second is there's rabbinic citations from Talmud or from Mishnah that serve as a sort, in the middle of everything else, we're doing Torah study. Okay, right in the early part of the service, there's this whole section of Mishnah, and we study a section, and then we say the Kaddish to Rabbanan, the rabbi's Kaddish. There's medieval poetry that permeates the Siddur. The best example is Adon Olam. It's really it's not prayer in the traditional sense in any way, it's poetry. It's medieval poetry. And it reflects the times and the needs of the people of the time. There's clever word plays. There's often alphabetic acrostics because they didn't have concrete copies of the Siddur, so people had to memorize it. And using an alphabetical acrostic is a good mnemonic device. Most of all, what makes the Siddur different from most other documents is the insertion of the rabbinic concept of a blessing. The whole Siddur is set up in structures around blessings. That's what we're going to talk a lot about today, is a structure. And this insertion, most prayers, if you look in most other communities, are not done that way. It's all about the blessings and what leads up to them. All right, so I've biblical citations, rabbinic citations, medieval poetry, blessings, all of that is merged together. And figuring out which is which and how it fits is important. The Siddur itself, the word Siddur is the same word as Seder. It means order. And it's orderly enough to be worthy of that term, but its historical development has been anything but. Okay? What you have in the Siddur, and this is why I find it fascinating, is essentially what is spiritual tell. A tell, think of Tel Aviv. Tel means it's a mountain in which as you dig deeper, you find other civilizations. It's one civilization built upon another, okay? And if you dig into the Siddur, what you're going to find over time is the concerns of a people 500 years ago, the concerns of a people 800 years ago, the concerns of a people and going back and back, and it's built one upon the other. Right? And so you're getting a sense of Jewish history while you're engaged in prayer. What were the thoughts? What were the ideals and the hopes and the anxieties of people? When you write a prayer, it's in response to something that's going on. Perfect example, if you go back to the Silverman Siddur, it was written in 1947, there's no prayer for the state of Israel. Okay? Because there was no Israel. And so now the prayer book, no matter how far forward we go, people will know that those were the concerns from 48 on. That's true throughout. You're going to find the different concerns from different eras built into the construction of the Siddur. The one thing that's really different about the Bible is closed. We don't add chapter 51 to Genesis. We just don't. Okay? We don't add to the Talmud. It's closed. Most Jewish documents at this point are closed. The Siddur is the exception. It remains open, that there's new prayers that get added, a la State of Israel, new concerns. You see all sorts of things that have been added to the prayer book in recent years. And so it's an open document, unlike all the other documents. Because it reflects history and the history of our people, it's one of the reasons why, I'm going to share with you my views. We all have different views on what things should be. It's one of the reasons why the core service shouldn't be touched. Because when you start moving around and eliminating certain things from the service, you're disregarding history. You're saying my current needs are more important than my historical connections. Contemporary needs take priority. And that's not a Jewish value. It's just not. Judaism is a religion couched in history. Right, so the question is about tweaks within the text itself. There are little tweaks, and yes, there are ways in which you can change a word or change something that will not necessarily it reflects the ideas of the imahot, the mothers. And there's another way in which it reflects our current standards. But I'm going to address a little bit about how I approach it, because our new prayer book has that within it. And I'm going to tell you what I've made as a decision and how I use it. And when I sat down with all the daveners, I expressed to them, here's what I think we should be doing. At the same time, I said, it's your call. If you're davening, you get to make the choice. But here's what I'd recommend. And I'll get into that, okay? Ultimately, prayer is a very personal experience. And the question is, how do you take it from the rote, because the words are meant to be recited, how do you take that and get it into tefillah, into actual, really prayer? And the answer to that is preparation. The answer is preparation. Rashi teaches that the root of the word tefillah is to bond. It's obviously to bond with God. That's the goal of prayer, is to bond with God and to have God bond with us. There's a concept among the Hasidim of dveikut. Dveikut is we use the word v'dabek libehenu, v'dabek. Dveikut is the same thing. Means in a sense to get rid of the barriers. All right, cling is one way to translate. But from the Hasidic approach, what it's saying is like a raindrop that falls out of the sky and falls into a puddle, the raindrop loses its identity once it hits that puddle. It's no longer individual. The goal of prayer is to eliminate yourself, to bond with God in such a way that there are no more barriers. You merge. That's the goal. Now, can you get there all the time? Of course not. It also depends on where we're at, what you're bringing to the situation. But that's the goal, in a sense, is to become one with God. There are people who would say the universe, and people would say with the spiritual. I go directly, it's God. You don't have to agree, that's where I'm at. And so our goal is to remove all of the barriers that exist to get us there. Think of a cell phone, it's wireless. I was on the phone this morning with somebody, and she was in a car, and I'm in a car, and it keeps going in and out. Right? We've all had this experience. So sometimes what you need to do is reposition yourself so that you can be heard and you can speak. Same thing is true with prayer. Sometimes you need to reposition yourself emotionally, reposition yourself in terms of turning things off from the world in order to really engage in prayer. All right. The Talmud states that the rabbis, the tzaddikim of early ages, would spend an hour meditating before they began prayer. An hour before Baruch Hu. And that's turned into, in many ways, one of the ways the rabbis did that is they read the entire book of Psalms prior to beginning prayer. We have remnants, you'll see, we have remnants of that. So we always recite Psalm 150. Hallelujah, hallelujah, right? We always recite 150 because it's the last psalm. And it's sort of meant to remind you the rabbis used to read the entire book. We do a little hint at, well, if you really want to be serious, go back and read the 149. You don't walk in off the street and just sort of shift into a God space. It doesn't work like that. Nothing, anything you do, you exercise, you're going to stretch before, or you're going to pay the consequences. Right? It isn't going to work, and you'll probably be sore beyond belief. Anything you do, if you sing, if you love my shower on Saturday mornings, all right? La, 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 and the dog is looking at me like, what the heck? Okay? You prepare, you don't just get out of bed and get there. It doesn't work that way. You don't come from the workplace and just shift into God's space. And so you'll see the way the service is structured, and I'll show you in a little while. There's a preliminary service. There's a Kabbalat Shabbat. They're not actually prayer. Their intent is meditative. Their intent is to get you there so that you can pray, that you can be in a God space. Okay. Peter.
We can talk, here again, I don't know what I'm talking about, but we can talk about
I don't either, so we're good.
the Tanakh, but if the Siddur is constantly changing, is it possible to talk about the Siddur? This is not the Orthodox Siddur, I don't think.
So it is not, but as you'll see, I'm going to finish up today going through the structure. There are structures that seem to have remained in their big picture across the movements. Okay? There are minor modifications, and I'll go through some of those as we go through the prayers themselves over the next year and a half, but the structure remains the same. And I'm going to leave that for the second half of the class. Okay? One of the key features of Jewish prayer is its communal nature. The first thing you say when you walk into a synagogue is Ma tovu o halecha. It's in the singular. The next time it's in the singular is the second half of Adon Olam shifts into the singular. The first thing and the second half of the last prayer you say on the way out. Everything else is in the we. It's in the we. You don't find me. You don't find I. The goal is to be part of something larger. The concerns are those of the community, not the individual. There are places to put individual concerns in. It's not like that can't happen. But the service itself is structured in the collective. There's an emphasis on our responsibility one to the other. By praying as a group, we come together as a group. You can fulfill your prayer, the halakha, the obligation of prayer. You can fulfill that independently. But Jewish tradition says it's far better to do so as a community. And by doing this, you become aware of the needs. Every week we have a mishaberach for somebody who's ill. We do a wedding, a bless. By so doing, the prayer becomes the opportunity to build connections with the community. You're aware of what's going on in people's lives. Okay. That's one of the real goals. It takes you from being egocentric to being communally minded. That's an important part of prayer. It also, by doing it communally, enables the unknowledgeable. In other words, if I don't know, I can kind of follow along and say, Amen. And I have a role in this process. So the unknowledgeable have a way in through the communal nature of prayer. Hebrew. Now, technically, you can pray in any language you want. The Amidah in particular, by definition, you can. Hebrew, however, is definitely the preferred language of Jewish prayers for centuries and centuries and even today. Despite the fact that halakha says that you can pray in any language, there are some important reasons why maintaining the Hebrew is key. The first is, if you've ever traveled, I know I went to Spain years ago. My Spanish it's okay. I can sort of make myself understood, and people will point and laugh a lot, but they get what I'm saying. I walk into the synagogue and I go, oh, thank God. I know what's going on here. They're all saying the same prayers I said. You go to Italy, same prayers. Go to France, same prayers. There's a unity cross-culturally to the Hebrew. And that's an important piece of it. The second is that also it means I'm also praying the same prayers my grandfather and my great-grandfather and beyond. I'm connecting not just horizontally, I'm connecting vertically. Yes? The Aramaic prayers, the answer is yes, because it was 2,000 years ago when the Aramaic prayers started to end. Aramaic was their English. Okay? Aramaic was their English. And most of the prayers are in Hebrew. There are reasons why certain prayers are in Aramaic, and when we get to them, I will address the specifics, but it was their language of the time. Kaddish is a perfect example, is in Aramaic, not Hebrew. Yeah. Yeah. Well, the Reform movement, right, and we'll get into why the Reform movement did some of what it did. But if you go back to the Middle Ages in particular, or when the Muslims conquered a lot of the world, Aramaic was the language, and in certain ways what it enabled is Jews all over that world to be able to engage with everybody. People spoke Aramaic the way we speak English. It was widespread. Okay? No, for sure. It existed before. Right. It's sort of a Judeo-Aramaic. In other words, what they did is they took Arabic and Aramaic and put it into Hebrew letters. It's our transliteration. It's, Baruch, B-A-R-U-C-H, right? That's the equivalent. All right. The other thing is that we know that the Siddur is, in a sense, the last connection to Hebrew. Most people do not have the Bible. By keeping Hebrew in the Siddur and in prayer, we have greater access to the Bible. We have greater access to all other Jewish documents. Take it away, and suddenly those documents are completely foreign and lost to us. And the last thing is, sociologically, you know that when a language disappears, so does its culture. So does Yiddish is the best example. If you get rid of Hebrew, a lot of Jewish living will disappear. Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a mystical sense to it, and particularly when you get into I'll take a question next. When you get into the Hasidic world, mysticism drives them. I'm not a mystic, I'll tell you up front, I'm a rationalist, but I understand that kind of mysticism can underlie things, for sure. Yes? When we get to them, yes. All right, we're going to take the Siddur apart. Right now I'm doing an overview. Okay, I promise we will do that. Now the question comes, why sing? Okay, Judaism is this basic principle called Hidur Mitzvah. That when you perform a mitzvah, a commandment, you should do so in the most beautiful way possible. Hidur, H-I, Hidur. Most of us have Seder plates that are not just plain looking, right? Torah covers, we spent an awful long time making sure the Torah covers are beautiful. Your mezuzot in your home, all sorts of things around that. There is an extra special level to doing something in a way that is beautiful. Judaism has said that music adds that level. Singing adds a level. It doesn't matter what you sing like, that's God's fault. Okay? Right, all of us, every cantor I know would love to be able to sing like Rosenblatt or some, one of these great cantors of the past. We all would have chosen something better than we got. I don't care who you are, okay? And so that's God's fault. But that you can add beauty by adding music. Even my mom, who couldn't sing in the least, it adds beauty to the service. I remember there are people who've come and said, can I just read Torah without the melody? And the rabbi has said, no. Because there's a power. It doesn't matter how bad it is. There's a power to music in a lot of ways. Yeah. It does. So perfect example is all of us have the melodies that we grew up with in your teenage years are probably very powerful for you. You hear a song, I hear certain songs, and I hear myself going my way down to the beach, New Jersey shore. Right? That's just the way it is. I hear the melody, and the association is made. And so there's a power to keeping certain melodies the same. There's also a power to changing certain melodies. Yes? Mm-hmm. Yeah. So with the destruction of the temple, instruments were forbidden on Shabbat. Okay? Now there is some movement back in some conservative synagogues to add instruments, but I'm not going to tell you, this is one of the ways in which Rabbi Teller and I are just in different places on an issue. He loves the instruments, and for him it adds to his experience. Kol hakavod, great. For me, it detracts from the experience. Who's right? Doesn't matter. It doesn't matter.
A quick experience that happened at the synagogue several years ago. There was an Israeli couple. The husband was Israeli, the wife was American. He did international travel. He was on a plane that crashed in Nigeria.
Right. So, just, without the backstory, give me what is it you were trying to say?
So he liked that song.
Mm-hmm.
So to honor him,
Yeah.
one of our members arranged, our choir came in during the week and sang that song for the wife and the children.
We all do those kinds of things. When Rabbi Artson was here, no one else except for him would know something I did. Rabbi Artson had been the rabbi of the congregation I was in Orange County before I got there. I got there later. We shared the same cantor. I was the education director and executive director. We shared the same cantor, and he had a melody he used, Vayechulu Hashamayim v'haaretz, and I've kind of introduced it here occasionally. I knew, he's sitting there going, that's Yossi Chazan's melody. I built a connection between us by using the same melody we both recognized, and I could see the grin on his face. Okay? He knew what I was doing. So the melodies really have significance in Jewish tradition. There is a tone and a mood that is created so that each service in the course of the year has its own tonal structure, its own nusach. The best example of this is Kaddish. All right, I'll give you a bunch. Shabbos we do Yikada v'Yikada Shemei Rabbah. Okay, we get to the high holidays. Yikada v'Yikada Shemei Rabbah. Da 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 da. You hear the melody and you know where you are in the calendar year. You get to Geshem, the prayer for rain. It's Yikada. The rain is falling. It's telling you what's going on just through the melody. That's why in my mind, random melodies do not fit in the service. It is meant to tell you where you are in the ritual of the year, just through the melody. There's a mode there. You have lots of those different things that just echo. You hear Kol Nidre and you know the melody. You know you're sitting there on Yom Kippur. No one has to tell you what's going on. You don't have to know anything. No, it's Kol Nidre. That's it. The melodies are meant to be, the weekday melodies are different. Shabbos we do Baruch Atah Adonai on the Amidah. Weekday Baruch Atah Adonai Eloheinu v'Elohei Avotenu. It's a different melody. You know it's Shabbat. You know it's a weekday without any other knowledge of what's going on. Okay? It is built in. Friday night has its own melodies. Friday night's all in a minor key. It's meant to be mellow. Saturday morning switches into what's known as a variation on a harmonic minor. You have what you'd probably recognize it as Jewish music. Ya-da, da, 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 da. There's a shift in one of the notes. One of the notes goes up a third. It goes up a half tone. Okay? And so it creates, there's a tension to it. The music of Saturday morning has a tension that doesn't exist on Friday night, very deliberately. All right. Jewish prayer, the Shliach Tzibor, the person who is sent up to lead. That's what it's called, the Shliach Tzibor. If the person is a professional, they call him a chazan, but it's the same thing. He's serving the same role. The chazan is not a surrogate like in many other places. Rather, it's a leader of prayer. It's an enabler for everybody to come together. The original role of the Shliach Tzibor was to repeat the Amidah. Why? Because this way people who weren't able to recite the Amidah on their own could hear the blessings and say Amen and fulfill their obligation by so doing. That's why when you go into a lot of Orthodox synagogues and they get to the repetition of the Amidah, so people are chatting. Why are they chatting? Because they've already fulfilled the obligation. They were able to do it on their own privately. Okay? This really is an enabler for those who can't. And so that's you see that. The role of the chazan is to keep everybody together, setting the pace. We start each paragraph together, we finish it. So then go to the next. All right? And you keep everybody in some kind of pattern. So in your packets, in the first, there's attributes of a good Shliach Tzibor. Okay? Pronounces all the words, the Hebrew words, correctly with the right accents. In other words, not putting the emphasis on the wrong syllables. We can at times, yes, we can, because some of the melodies get written and it makes, you'll hear Alphivus and shift some of the way the words are pronounced to get to the right accent. Martin Kagan does that too. All right, and I get it. I understand exactly what they're trying to do, because a lot of times the congregational melodies can lend themselves to improper accents. But you should certainly be aware of the accents. Knowing the correct nusach, what is the right melodies for the specific services? It is inappropriate to get up and use a different nusach. Being aware of the order of the service. So if you're leading and you're sitting there and going, I finished page 26, where do I go next? Let me look here, it's in my notes here somewhere. That's not a function. That's not functioning in a proper way. You're leading a community in prayer. You need to know in advance what you're doing. Introducing and closing a prayer with a full, strong voice. Okay, people should know when you're finished together. Leading the congregational singing with a dominant voice in terms of key and pace. I tell the kids when they're leading, even if it's something everybody's going to sing, that first word you tell us is telling us the key. Are we here or are we here? Okay, where are we? As well as what's the pace that's coming. You've got to communicate that, and you get one word to do it. Okay? And in my mind, the most importantly, is that you take prayer seriously. If you think you're standing in front of a congregation and performing, you don't belong on the bima. You're standing before God.
But we talk about the great canons of the Golden Age, and even today, as someone performs synagogue, I have heard canons sing in a way that I couldn't possibly follow along with them myself.
There's a difference that I get. If you understand, and I love cantorial music for a very particular reason, what they're doing with their voice in those settings is interpreting a word. There are things you should do on certain words. There are things you shouldn't do. And even if in all of the Kala Torah that they're playing with, it has to reflect what's going on. So one of the things one of my mentors taught me is when you get to God's name, go up. There's lots of ways you can do Baruch Atah Adonai. You can do Baruch Atah Adonai. I don't do the second. right? So your melody needs to interpret, and what the great cantors did, most people did, if those who knew the Hebrew and understood what was going on, recognized that it wasn't performance. It was a dialogue with God. Okay? One of my favorite stories is a synagogue in New York where the rabbi and the cantor stand up by the bima and they just face the ark and daven. And people are encouraged to come in and just sing with them. They're not, when you see me up here, you'll notice 90% of the time my eyes are closed. There's nothing more distracting than a human face. When you're trying to engage with God, children, babies will turn to a face, a structure of a face. We're primed for that. You take a circle and you draw mouth and eyes on it, babies will turn to that naturally. We're distracted by the human face. If I'm performing, I'm going to look out and smile at everybody. If I'm davening, that's the last thing I want to do. I can love all of you, but that's not the moment for it. What's that? Right. 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 I want to just talk about kavanah and keva, the formal structure of prayer versus personal, individualized kind of prayer. There is a great value to both. Number one, by sticking to the structure as it exists. One, you're identifying with history and the people before you. Two, you're identifying cross-culturally. Three, it's not random what's there. Some of you may have heard me talk about this before. My mom would often talk about old movies, how they're great. And she's right. Because what still we see today has already been sifted through. That which was garbage is gone. All right? All the old movies we see on television are the best of the best from that time. The other ones are gone. You know when the movies come out each year, you have a sense some of these are going to be gone within 6 months, and some of them, 50 years from now, people will still be watching them. And so there's a sifting that goes on. The likelihood is with all the melodies and all the prayers that are being written today, 150 years from now, 3 or 4 of them will still exist. People will sift through what was the best. And the prayer book represents that which survived. It was the best of the best. That which wasn't got lost. It's gone. So you've got the best of the best sitting there in front of you, and so there's a value to that. It's like poetry. Some poetry survives, and some poetry just gets lost. That which is great lasts. So there's a power to doing what's already structured there. But the same rabbis who said you must do the structured service would say to you, if that's all you do, you missed. In the Amidah in particular, there's a place to put in that which is personal to you above and beyond. So if all you do is the keva, you haven't achieved prayer. If you don't do the keva, the structured, you haven't achieved prayer. Okay? Yes. Yeah, for sure. Well, on Shabbat, you don't ask, and so the Amidah is different. On a weekday, there's 13 requests in the Amidah, and Shabbat is one blessing of the sanctification of Shabbat. And when we get to the Amidah, I promise I'll pull that out, so don't stress. On Shabbat, there's a Jewish tradition of you don't ask for things on Shabbat. And even where we sort of do like a Mishaberach, we never ask God to heal. We say, we hope it's God's desire that. Right. That's a place, yeah. So you do the structured blessing. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, but what you did first was the structured bracha, okay, the keva. Yes, I remember my mom doing the same thing, for sure. I do that, when I finish the Amidah, I've got this whole list of people in my head that I'm going through and saying, it's why sometimes I'm staying there a little longer. It's not what's on the page, I'm adding my own stuff. So what exactly is kavanah? Many of you know Rabbi Judith Abrams was a member of the congregation, was here in the congregation for many years. She's written many books. I've given you here in the handout something she wrote that to me is a perfect description of what kavanah is. All right, so if you look at the second on that same page, imagine you are Don Larson, the pitcher for the New York Yankees, yay, in the 1956 World Series. It is the 9th inning. You've already struck out 2 batters. If you strike out the next batter, you win the game and will pitch the first perfect game in World Series history. You peer in at Yogi Berra's mitt, the catcher. You don't even hear the crowd or the rapid beating of your own heart. You're concentrating so intensely. Your entire being is focused on getting the ball into his mitt. The ability to direct one's whole being intensely like this is kavanah. It's brilliantly written. Yeah, it's exactly it. Michael Jordan used to talk about he'd just get into this zone and he didn't know why the ball was just going in. He could be doing a back and whatever, and it's just going in. And it's just there. And you don't even know there's a crowd around you.
Would you be quoting this if it were the Red Sox?
No, you don't. You don't. It's first, Heschel talks about the fact that we need to reach up. The question is, what are the moments God is reaching down? And that's, the more often you reach up, the more likely to hit that moment. It's obviously an analogy. It's not meant to be taken literally, but that's the concept. He was. That made it all the more special, right?
It's so wonderful because Rabbi gave him some blessing and he was such a respected Talmudic scholar. And her write a book on baseball.
Well, she didn't. This is the introduction to her book on Talmud. Yes, it actually is from the beginning of her book on Talmud. She's talking about kavanah, and she didn't write a book on baseball. So, the next question is: does God answer prayer? Right? We all we knew this, we'd all be much more comfortable, and the answer is we don't. One of the presuppositions of prayer is that we are empowered to make requests because we have this covenant with God. We have an already established relationship, and therefore making requests within a relationship is not unusual. Okay? However, we don't know whether our requests will be granted. That's the difference between prayer and magic. Magic, by definition, has to work, or it's not magic. I put in my coin, I get my prize. Prayer, in order for it to be certain, to be absolute, has to have the potential for God to say no. I teach theology to our 10th graders, and oftentimes I'll do a session on them with God, and they'll say, well, I don't believe in God because when I wanted this, God didn't, whatever it is. And my answer to that is, so in other words, you don't want a God you serve, you want a God who serves you. Okay? That you want to force God's hand to give you what you want. Well, good. And so God's your slave. Good. I'm not sure that's going to work out real well for you. Okay? And so in order for prayer to be prayer, God has to have the ability to say yes, but God also has to have the ability to say no. We don't know why. I'm not going to stand here before you and try and postulate why. But for God to be God, there has to be the opportunity to say yes or no. All right. I want you to open up the Siddur to page 47. Page 47, yeah. Well, because it's Friday night first. And then there's all the commentary, right? Yeah. Okay. Yeah, believe me. Mm-hmm. That's right. Believe me, we're all struggling with this right now. So a couple things that are built into this new prayer book. Number one is there are ritual instructions. So for example, if you look at the word Baruch, the first word in the Hebrew there in the 2 paragraphs, next to it you'll see this sort of red. It's meant to tell you this is where you bow. You see the little red, it's kind of a person, I'm not sure what it is.
Like a cursive thing?
Yeah. Right. When they've included ritual instructions built in. So that little symbol there is telling you this is a place you bow. No. And I'll get into that when we get there. All right? But there are certain kinds of things built in. The second is if you look on the left column has the inclusion of women. So you have here, Baruch atah Adonai, praise are you, Adonai, Eloheinu ve'Elohei Avotenu, our God and God of our ancestors. And then ve'imotenu is in parentheses, and our mothers. Elohei Avraham, God of Abraham, God of Isaac, God of Jacob. And then it continues, God of Sarah, God of Rachel, Rebekah, God of Rachel, and God of Leah. In parentheses is imotenu. So here's what I've determined, and here's what I've recommended. I don't say the word in parentheses because the Hebrew doesn't require it, and I'll tell you why. Where they added the names, that's I add. I don't have a problem with adding the names. In Hebrew, however, avotenu can mean either our fathers or, more inclusively, our ancestors. And if you translate it as it in modern Hebrew, it's true as well, you don't need the word imotenu. And by adding the names of the mothers after it anyway, it's already clear what you meant. So to add extra words in my mind is unproductive, unless there's really a message. You've already, by naming Sarah, Rebekah, Rachel, and Leah, it's clear that avotenu means ancestors. It doesn't mean fathers. Yeah. Yeah, and sometimes it is, but here that's not it. This is about mothers versus how you translate avotenu, and avotenu can just simply mean ancestors. By including the names of the women, you've made that point already. It's redundant. Yes, yes, yes.
So this is something that we wrestle with somewhat in English. Some people object to each of us should take his coat off. Should it be his or her?
Right.
And it's the same thing we now have
Right.
Latinx instead of Latino.
Yeah, and in particular as we get into a somewhat genderless society, Hebrew is a mess. Because not only do you have to change all the pronouns, all the possessives. Your is, in English, it's the same for both genders. In Hebrew, it's not. So now you got a mess. Okay? Right, yes. Mm-hmm.
After all these centuries, when women didn't pray the same as men,
Right.
and we're supposed to be equal, our prayers are just as important.
So how does it, right, by including the,
Having the women included
right.
makes us feel.
Right, and that's why we do it. But you don't need the additional word imotenu to include that. If you're listing Sarah, Rebekah, Rachel, and Leah, you know the word avotenu was meant to mean ancestors.
Why say the fathers?
It doesn't say fathers. Avotenu is either fathers or ancestors. In the way Hebrew works,
Abraham, Jacob.
well, right, because you say Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Sarah, Rebekah, Rachel, and Leah. So it's all. Right. It has to mean ancestors. The minute you include the women's names, that word avotenu has to mean ancestors, or the whole thing falls apart. So it's a superfluous word to just add imotenu. Again, obviously not everyone agrees. That's been my approach. I believe I'm being just as inclusive without adding that word. I find that word redundant. Okay? Doesn't mean I'm right. But as a cantor, I get to make those kinds of decisions. But I'm not, in so doing, choosing to exclude women. That is not the intent in any way. Right, they're listed. They're there. It's clear that's what it means.
So when you said the word in parentheses, is that only when there's matriarch and patriarch?
Yeah, well, no, it just means mothers. And the word before it can mean, if you're saying fathers, you want to add mothers. But if the word before says ancestors, if you're saying ancestors and mothers, then mothers aren't ancestors. It's actually negative. It excludes women from being part of the ancestry. Okay. Turn to page 55. You'll find here the Friday evening Kiddush. There's something else they've done here. 55. And I want you to look at the next to last line in the Hebrew. V'shabbat kod shecha. Why did I say, what is the T vowel? It's an ah, right? In modern Hebrew, it's an ah. Where did I get code? All right, well, the cue to you is that it's longer. It's longer because it's known as a kamatz katan. There are about 7 rules during which that ah becomes an o. One of them is when it appears in an unaccented closed syllable. Most of you are not going to stress yourself out over it. And so what they've done is, if you look at that second word, the T vowel under the kuf is longer than it normally is. Look at some of the others. They've extended that vowel to tell you that it's an O. Oh. Right? So they've built this in, and the High Holiday prayer book has the same thing. The Moksha has the same thing. They're giving you a cue, so you don't need to know all the grammatical rules. It's telling you this one is different. It's much harder, right? They still could have done a better job than they did here, but nonetheless, it's there. Okay? All right. I have 15 minutes left to do the structure. I'm never going to get through it. So we're going to start. What I'm going to do with you, I'm going to ask you to turn to this page without going further. We're going to do one page at a time because I'm going to take what's embedded in each page and continue to extend it. Okay? So, if you look at the Saturday morning service, there are theoretically 4 parts. There's the preliminary, there's the morning service of Shacharit, there is the Torah reading, and then there's the additional. Musaf means additional. It represents the additional sacrifice that was made in the temple in Jerusalem on Shabbat. So those are the 4. Okay? Flip the page, and you'll see what I'm starting to do here. You'll notice in dark blue, I subdivide those categories further. Okay? There's 2 parts to the preliminary service. There's Birchot HaShachar, which are things that were originally said at home. The opening blessings are, thank you, God, for giving the wisdom to the rooster to know the difference between day and night. What's that about? Thank you, God, there's an alarm clock. Nature works. Okay? That's really what it's saying. All right? Psukim de Zimra are psalms and songs. Remember what I said to you about this sense of meditating on Psalms before you even begin. So the first thing you'd walk in, you'd find Baruch She'amar would be the beginning of the service. Now, ultimately, they moved the other part to the synagogue too. But you start out with the morning blessings, you then go into these series of Psalms, and then you can actually begin services with Baruch Hu, the Shachari. Baruch Hu is a call to worship. Okay? Plain and simply, the leader gets up and says, praise are you, Adonai. The congregation says, we agree. Baruch Adonai Baruch Le'olam Voed, and the leader repeats as a way of saying, I too am a member of the community. Okay, that's the first part. The second part is the Shema and the 3 surrounding blessings. You have a blessing, and I'll talk about that in a second. 3 surrounding blessings and the Amidah. Those are the 2 components. Shema and its blessings, the Amidah. 2 components of the Shacharit service. The Torah service is a coronation. You may have heard me say this many times on the Bima. Removal of the Torah, the actual reading of the Torah. On Shabbat, we add a section from the prophets as well, known as the Haftarah, and then putting the Torah away. 4 subdivisions of that. And Musaf is an Amidah and closing prayers. Now, I'm going to tell you there's no such thing as a service without an Amidah. So what's the problem with the Torah service? Torah service is actually part of Musaf. Yeah, it's actually part of Musaf. And I'll explain that a little more as we're going. Flip the page.
Can you repeat that? What part of it?
Amidah, Torah services, right. Flip the page. Now we're going to yet another embedded level. So you have the opening blessings that were recited at home. There's the 15 blessings, Baruch Atah, right, etc. You have then the Shema. There's one line Shema. At points in history, the people in the larger community forbid us to recite Shema. They knew where it was said in the service. They'd show up at that moment to make sure Jews didn't say it. And so Jews put it somewhere else. It got built into the preliminary service as a way of saying it even though we can't say it. There's text study, and then there's a psalm for the day. All this, okay, that's the first part. You then get into Pesukei de Zimra, Psalms and Songs. Baruch She'amar is just a rabbinic listing of understandings of God. You have Psalms of Praise, Ashrei. Big Psalm. Ashrei is one of the Psalms, Psalm 145. The last 5 Psalms of the, so 145, tradition is you read 145, 146, 147, 148, 149, 150. Why? Because you're remembering that they used to read all 150. Now synagogues, most conservative synagogues at this point, no longer do that. We do 145 and jump to 150. So we have a symbolic reminder of what we used to do when we did 6, which is a reminder when we used to do 150. Okay? That's what's going on. All right, you have the Song of the Sea. Again, you're trying to get yourself into the mindset of relationship with God. The Song of the Sea is a celebration of survival after the Exodus. And then Yishtabach. Yishtabach is the blessing. Baruch She'amar starts out with a blessing. And so all these biblical readings that we had, there's a blessing before you start, Baruch She'amar. There's a blessing after you finish, Yishtabach. And if you look at the 2 blessings, they're basically saying the same thing. Okay? It's like Torah blessings. When you go up to read a section of Torah, it's surrounded by blessings. Well, you read all these biblical readings, it's surrounded by Baruch She'amar and Yishtabach. Shacharit. Baruch Hu, starting out Shema. Shema and its blessings. There are 3 conceptual blessings. There's 3 approaches to God. One is God as creator. All right, we talked about Yotzer, or God forms. Blessing of revelation, meaning Sinai, that's Ahava Rabbah. God, it's not God's love. That's not what that prayer is about. It's about God's love as manifested through Torah. Right? It's not just this ephemeral love. Torah is the symbol of God's love. And then the last one is the blessing of redemption. God redeems. Okay, so there's 3 blessings surrounding the Shema. The Amidah, again, is structured in a very similar way. On Shabbat, there's 7 blessings. The first 3 are the same as they are all year long, blessings of praise. God, you are wonderful. Atah gibor le'olam, ha'el hagadol hagibor v'hanara. You are a great, mighty, and awesome God. You're amazing. Gee, Dad, I love your tie. Okay? You finish it with 3 blessings of thanks. Modim anachnu lach. On a weekday, in between the praise and the thanks, are 13 requests. Think of it as, Dad, I want the car. How am I going to get the car from Dad? Dad, I love your tie. I want the car. And Dad, thank you. It's exactly the same thing. On Shabbat, we don't make requests. And so instead of those requests, in its place is a blessing of Mikadesh HaShabbat, sanctifying Shabbat. Same thing with holidays. You have the same thing. Okay? So that's the Amidah. Turn the page, a Torah service. This is probably comfortable with the Torah reading. You have the Aliyot, people coming up. Traditionally, the person who got called for an Aliyah also read the Torah. All right? Over time, that disappeared because people couldn't. You have the Mishaberachs announcing all the communal events. The Haftarah is the prophetic reading. You have a blessing for the new month on those weeks where it's appropriate. Ashrei also shows up here again. The rabbis taught that if you say Ashrei 3 times a day, you'll be granted the world to come. Who knows what they were thinking? All right? And then you put the Torah away. I do have a sense of what they're thinking, but it's not critical here. Musaf. The same structure to the Amidah. The 3 blessings of praise, the 3 blessings of thanks. In between is the blessing that talks about the sacrifice that was made in the temple. In the Orthodox prayer book, it'll say, someday we will, na'aleh, we will go up and do. In the conservative prayer book, it says, asu, remember when we used to do it, because there's no hope of, it's not our goal to return to the sacrifice. Right, as Andy liked to say, it's a barbecue, right? And then the closing prayers. Once you've said the full Kaddish, the service is really over, and then there's just a number of psalms that got added, Ein Eloheinu, Aleinu, and Adon Olam. All right? That's why you'll see, in many ways, the service is really over. These are just throw-ons at the end. Flip to the next page, 7. And what I've done here is add all the Kaddishes. Okay, Kaddish serves in many ways as punctuation. It's really praise. Yit gadol it's the Aramaic form of gadol, great. But yit kadash, the Aramaic form of kadosh, holy. Great and holy, shmei, shem, rabbah is your name. Okay, that's what it's really talking about. But it serves many purposes. Its original purpose was as a study, as a way of responding after study. The Kaddish de Rabbanan, the rabbi's Kaddish, is its original form. Right? They would study, then they would praise God when they finished, and therefore they said it in their vernacular. The praise was they added this vernacular praise of God for their study session. It then takes on other forms. You'll see the Chatzi Kaddish about halfway down. Chatzi Kaddish, Chatzi means, in a sense, half. It's most of the text, but not all of it. When it shows up in that form, it's a comma. Meaning, you're within one service, but they're breaking the service in half. They're dividing it. Yes? That's a rabbi question. Each congregation has their own. That's not a. I can't answer that because, and I'm not saying it's right or wrong. But the reality and the thought is, yeah, I don't know.
Is that to say we're breaking it apart because we're putting a distinction between
What you've done is separate shacharit from the preliminary service, right? But there's no Amidah in the preliminary service, so it's not its own service, but they're making a distinction here. You'll see the same thing if you turn to the next page when you get to Musaf. There's a Chatzi Kaddish between the Torah service and Musaf because the Torah service has no Amidah. And so therefore it's not a service unto its own, it's a division of two. So it serves as a comma in that setting. When you're finishing a service, the Kaddish Shalem serves as the period. And so you will see it at the end of the Shacharit service, during which we said an Amidah, and you'll see it at the end of Musaf, during which we said an Amidah. Again, there's no service without an Amidah. They're subdivisions. And so Torah service and the preliminary are not really services. They're part of Shacharit and part of Musaf, but we subdivide them with the Chatzi Kaddish. Okay? Flip the page. Oh, and by the way, Mourner's Kaddish. I left Mourner's Kaddish out. So where does Mourner's Kaddish come? I mean, again, it's words of prayer. There's no concept of death at all in it. It's praise of God. Okay? When someone passed away and they had a Shiva minyan, the tradition was to study. You would study in honor of that person, some text. And what would you do when you finished studying text? You would say Kaddish. Over time, the study got lost, and Kaddish took its place. But it really doesn't talk about death at all. It's just a substitute for that study in memory of that person. It's come to take on new meaning, but that wasn't the intent as it was designed. It's just become sort of the way of the people at this point. So it's only listed, we do it early in the morning. Right, and there's actually other places you can add it. It's, in my mind, to some extent, that's just a matter of tradition, communal traditions. There are places where it's sort of obligated, and there are places where you can add, and again, it's a matter of what your community decides, and what are the needs of the community. There are communities where people come early and can't stay for the end, so you make sure you get a Kaddish early. There are people that come at the end and aren't there in the beginning, you get a Kaddish at the end. There are ways of trying to recognize the needs of your community. One and then two, yeah. Tikabel Tzalot Hon, why is it not there in Kaddish? Because Tikabel Tzalot Hon is a request, all right? And somebody who's in mourning conceptually is someone who's been denied what their request was. It's kind of uncomfortable to say, let me make another request here. And so the tradition is you take the Tikabel out. Yes?
There's a wonderful book called Kaddish by Leon, I can't pronounce his last name,
Yeah.
and it's both a memoir, but it's also a history of the evolution of the Kaddish.
Yeah, and it's a good book and it's worth reading. There's other books I'd recommend first. okay? In terms of the large structure of the service, like to pray as a Jew is a much more generic overview of the service. When you're ready to get deep down and do a deep dig, then that's a worthy read, all right? So going down, preliminary service is exactly what it was on the previous page under Shachrit. Now we begin I'm giving you the same three blessings. I further subdivided the embedded nature of what's going on here. So you begin in the blessing of creation, you have a rejection of dualism and idolatry. All right, throughout the beginning of the Shachrit service, like El Adon, you have these, why is there a mention of the sun? Right, it's kind of a bizarre thing. Because what they're doing is rejecting the ancient idea that the sun is a god. And instead, if you look at what it says, is God sets them in the sky. God is responsible for the way nature works. Nature's not a god. I know, I got 2 more minutes. Nature's not a god. The sun is simply fulfilling God's will. All right, so it's a rejection of what's going on in the society around it. You then have Kedusha de Yotzer, which if you don't have a minyan and you can't say the Kedusha, you need in the Amidah. The rabbis built a way around that. It's not Nikadesh, we sanctify. It talks about, well, the angels do it. And therefore you can kind of get by without a minyan. So they slipped it in there. You have the shift from a literal to a symbolic light. The beginning of it is Yotzer, Oru V'rei Choshech, who creates light and darkness. Okay, this is forming sun and darkness. The end, Or Chadash Al Tzion, when you talk about a new light, we're not getting a new sun. It's meant, the word light means something completely different by this point. It's wisdom, it's understanding. It's shifted its tone. All right, I think Chazan Kron will kill me if I continue on, so I'm going to stop now. That's good friends. I may have to pay for the next meal is what that means. Right, so I don't want to pay for the next meal. We're going to stop here. We meet again June 2nd, all right? And I'll try and finish this up at that point. Okay, we'll go on from there. Thank you all. Is what?